You can call my cell phone anytime you want. You can get to our website to kind of find where we are, or give us a call. So I'm kind of curious, and I want you to think about this. We can't really answer it through the webinar, but have you ever watched Kitchen Nightmares? You ever watch that show? It's a chef that goes around to different restaurants that are failing in a lot of different ways, and they're not paying attention to what they're doing. They might not be keeping their food fresh. They might not be treating their staff well. They might not have specifications on how to run the place. But if you are familiar with it, you kind of know why I'm putting it up there, because I kind of have to ask the question, have you ever had a contractor nightmare? And if you ever had one and you want to send me an email about it, I'd love to hear about it, because that's the way we can improve, and we can help other people improve upon the contracting experience. Contracting is a great way to get good people out there to do the work on your property, but it can also be a good way to get people that don't know what they're doing if we don't go about it in the right way. So just to kind of give you a couple examples that I've heard of, or I've had some of the people that we work for tell us about a contractor nightmare. One example that I heard about several years ago was down at Key Biscayne. Now, if you know this area very well, you have to take a boat to get out there. And I believe it takes 45 minutes to an hour each day to get load it up into the boat, take it out to one of the islands, do the work, and then an hour to get back. Well, they had what was theoretically a fully licensed crew. Everyone was legal, and they went through this process of getting there. But one day when they were out there going towards the island on the boat, the Coast Guard, I guess, pulled them over, checked all of their IDs, checked them all, and everyone in that boat was illegal. So essentially, this agency lost their contractor that day, because the entire crew from this whole operation was deported because they didn't have proper documentation. They weren't actually legal. Their papers weren't there. So that's one example of a contractor not being honest and not being prepared and giving what they needed to for a project. Another example of a contract or a problem with a contractor that I could think of was with the Tennessee State Parks. One of the state park managers here was telling us once about the time that they had to order T-shirts, or jackets for their rangers. And they had the contract go out, and they had the specifications, and they really weren't tight enough specs, but up until the last day, they had a lot of what looked like good quotes for the project. And on the very last day, a low bid came in, which they had to accept because they didn't do any specifications that would allow them to do otherwise. So when this bid came in, they took it. They had the jackets made. And unfortunately, they didn't put a very tight specification list together, because the jackets, the Ranger jackets that came, were fluorescent green. So what they had to wear for their Rangers at that point for the rest of the year were fluorescent green Ranger jackets, and they really couldn't change it because the money was spent. So just a couple quick examples of why it's important to really understand what you're doing when you're setting out to get a contractor in place. Now, at the end of this presentation, you can go to our website, invasiveplantcontrol.com, and I'm recording it right now, so you can look it up, and you can, if it's something you wanted to remember, you can look through the presentation and find it. It'll probably be posted on our web solutions site. So when you're in invasiveplantcontrol.com, just click on the IPC Web Solutions logo. It'll take you to where a lot of the online tools and the presentations are. So during this talk, we're going to talk about how to understand your contractual options, knowing the company you hire, stressing selectivity, defining the project, being tough, asking for more than just plant management, and performance guarantees. There's a lot more that you can look for, but that's what we're going to talk about today in the time we have. So with contractors, there's several advantages that you have. You can develop, these guys, these groups, these companies are built to prepare for developing and implementing training programs, providing skilled on-the-ground management. Now, you don't have to go out and search and train for people. There are people there that are just doing that, nothing else. They have a broad range of experience in planning and management projects. They can lobby and reach segments of the market that the government can't do. It's a good help for that. Contractors are able to create a pool of employees with on-the-ground experience. And I kind of stress that one here because, in the case with some of our guys, whenever we hire them, I kind of emphasize to them that I would love to see them go and work you know, their dream job someday may be for the government. Maybe they want to work for the National Park System. Maybe they want to be on an EPMT or a strike team for Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, it's a great training grounds for those guys, and then when they're done, it really creates a good pool of employees for other agencies. So contractors have a lot of benefits. But there's also a lot of problems involved. You kind of read through that Dilbert slide and you kind of get an idea what I'm talking about. Lots of times, many times, if you're not careful, you'll find the contractors that really don't know what they're doing. They're pretending to know what they're doing. They don't. They've not done this stuff before. Or maybe they're just doing it on the side in their off season. You know, related to getting a builder for building your house or putting up an addition or maybe someone to work on your car. Whenever you're going to go out and get your bids for this, you have people coming from every level, from people that have just started their business to people that have been in business for a long time. So you get everything from big price ranges to specifications that are completely different. So you have to be really careful, and that really causes a problem. So you have to think about that up front. It's hard to find a contractor that's qualified to work in a natural area where there's a lot of sensitive species that you want to protect. Many contractors have never done this before, and if they have, their employees may be day labor and they've never done it before, or they'll pick them up at 7-Eleven one morning, drop them off, pick them up a whole nother crew the next morning. So you have to, that's a problem that we really see in this industry. And it's a relatively new industry. There's very little history, so that's changing as the industry grows and the years go by, but that can be a problem as well. But there are solutions, and I think kind of look at this list, you can see about talking with your contracting agents. I think it's very important. Once you look at this talk, and we have a brochure you can pick up, a little booklet, talk to your contracting agent about invasive species management and how different specifications can improve upon the product and the service that you guys get. Consider speaking with other professional services departments to see what routes they take to bid out projects. Sometimes you'll realize there's a lot better ways of doing it than just doing the low bid. Certainly pricing is important, but there's other options when you can involve quality and experience a lot more and do a percentage rate. And oftentimes other professional services departments within your own organization, they do that already, and they can give you that experience. There's the option of working through existing contracts to get the contractors you want. Lots of times you don't want to bid it out. You want to use a specific company, but you can't use them because you have to go through the low bid process. Sometimes you can work through an existing contract to get the group that you want to be working with. You can set up the ability to extend contracts. You know, if you do bid it out and you get the person or the company that you want, then make sure it's a 3 to 5 year extension on that. If they do well in the first year, extend it into the next year. Put together an RFP and take the time to select a contractor based on weighted factors. So I'll say go to our website, invasiveplantcontrol.com, and you'll find this bid specifications booklet. We have hard copies as well. If you want to just send me an email, I can send you a copy. But it's a free booklet, and we put it together quite a few years ago now, but it has some really good pointers and tips on how to put together a project, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel if you can look at some of this first. Developing strong bid specs, which is what you're basically sending out in the beginning and saying, we have a project we want to do. We better put down the specifications of exactly what we want and what we want the outcome to be in the long term, short term and long term. It's going to improve your effectiveness. It's going to maximize the efficiency of your crews that are on the ground, minimize those problems because there's going to be rules in place the contractor has to follow. And it's also going to have remedies in place so that if something is messed up, there will be some type of solution already in writing. But you don't want to overdo it either. Like this cartoon on the bottom says, you don't want to smother either party. You want to make sure you're able to work together and it's effective for both groups. So the first and probably most important thing is know the company you hire. I've told people before I could give this presentation with just Dilbert slides. I think when you read Dilbert, you realize it's all about cubicles and offices and what can go wrong. Know the company you hire. Make sure that they're willing to talk to you. Make sure that you know the type of staff that they have, the type of employees they put on the ground in your project. If you have a project that's not selective at all, you might not be as worried about the group that's doing the treatments. But if you have a project where there's desirable species that could be damaged, make sure you know the people on the ground. Make sure you have a track record of who they are. Can you trust the staff that are going to be on the site? Make sure there's training programs in place for that staff. Make sure you're not just getting someone that was picked up the morning before and handed a chainsaw and said, go treat this. Because it's not just mistreating plants, it's also the danger that's involved with using tools like chainsaws and brush cutters. You know, in our case, we have interns come in each year. We do a nice training with them to make sure they understand the ins and outs of using the chainsaw. Maybe it's the crew leader in the field that's really putting that to them and making them understand the safety aspects of it. But make sure you can trust the staff that's on the site. There have been times in our case where, you know, our crews work all over the country, and we oftentimes will want to go into an area we haven't worked before. The first time we went into South Florida, we sent a team down there, all of our crew leaders that were around at the time and ourselves. We went down and spent a week and just volunteered our time. We spent a week working at the Everglades at the picture at Key Biscayne up there. That's where we heard the story about the contractor before. And we looked at the plants. We looked at the treatment methods. We tried to decide what works down there and, you know, what maybe they don't understand works better. You know, everybody was using machetes there. And you can see those stumps that are treated there. A lot of these stumps are just treated with machetes. We like to use brush cutters or chainsaws. And, you know, how does it work in this area versus another area? Make sure the company you hire, you know, does their diligence like this. They understand what they're getting into. Make sure they've done work in this area before, or at least done the research for working in this area. I can't stress enough to require a long list of references and to call those references. Email those references. Get all the information you can about this company. Lots of times people get the reference list, but they don't call those people. They don't try to dig into it. You can save yourself a lot of headaches if you just take this one step. Ask for at least 5 references from works completed in the last 3 years. Include the names, addresses, phone numbers. Make sure they put all the information down that you're asking for. And if they don't include some of the information, it's kind of a red flag to say, these people aren't thorough. Maybe they're not going to pay attention to what they need to do. If they can't do it on a form, are they going to be able to do it in the field? Make sure you summarize vegetation treated, success rates, equipment and application techniques that you would use. Ask them the type of equipment that they own and have in their hands right now. I've also heard stories of contractors taking a project and saying they had the equipment, but they didn't actually have the equipment. And then they had to go out, if they were going to do the project, and buy a $100,000 piece of equipment to do it. And then the process gets all messed up and everything gets delayed and it really doesn't work very well. So make sure the tools are actually in their hands. And when you're writing the bid specs, make sure that poor past performance is criteria for disqualifying a contractor. Write it in there. Make sure they understand that. And that way you're going to get references and you're going to be able to talk to those people. And if you want to hire someone, you want someone that's actually done good work in the past. Ask them, you know, put something together like this. This is for the National Arboretum, one of our clients up in D.C. You know, maybe you want to ask for, okay, give me a project name, the acres you worked, 1 or 2 contacts, the activity that you did on the ground, give some progress reports, the plant species that were treated. You can ask, you know, just for a simple table that shows all the species that were treated there. In this case, at the Arboretum, if we were to put together our reference list, it would show these plants with these treatment methodologies. It doesn't take long to do this, and if you've done it once, you'll have it in your hands for other bids. So asking a contractor to do this is not unreasonable, and it gives you a good idea of what they have and haven't done. And what you'll find out, too, is that a lot of these guys don't even know what some of these species are, and that's kind of another red flag to make sure you're careful on who you're hiring. You know, the next thing that I always like to emphasize is selectivity. Make sure that you put in your bid specifications enough rules and regulations on this project that say you have to be selective in the control, because the majority of you that are on the phone today work in natural areas where your job is to keep that natural area in pristine condition. And you're bringing in someone and asking them to spray a chemical on your property, or you're asking them to use a digging tool or a masticator or something to destroy part of that property in some way, make sure they know how to be selective. And you can be selective using a tiny little hand clipper, or you can be selective using a large mulching machine. It really depends on how you apply the treatments and how you do the work. So make sure it's written in there how to do that. Make sure they know if there's desirable species in the area. You know, are there economic incentives to protect the natives? Make sure that you understand that and they understand that. And what's the long-term management cost? And I guess at the end, the applicator is the ultimate selectivity tool. So they have to know what they're looking at. Make sure that they know the difference between the lookalikes. There might be a rare endangered plant that looks a lot like the undesirable species that you're treating. Make sure you can know the difference. In the background there, you can see an ailanthus versus a sumac. You know, that's another bad contractor story, another state park story, where they hired a contractor to come in, and the contractor came in and killed all the ailanthus on about 10 acres. The only problem is it ended up being sumac, which is a native plant in that park and something they really needed to keep. So they weren't watching over the contractor. They didn't make sure they understood what they were looking at before they did the treatments. You know, just to emphasize why it's important to do all this, have you ever looked at a stand? This is Ailanthus altissima, tree of heaven. This is in a place called Standing Stone. It's this particular area. We just took about an acre area. This was several years ago now, but we took about an acre area. It looks like it's predominantly ailanthus in there, and it really is chock full of it. You look at the canopy, and that's what you see. But if you really pay attention, and we did, and we walked around in the understory, and we looked at that acre, and we tried to pick out the species that were actually native and things that we wanted to keep, we were able to pinpoint and write down all those species. I went to a local native nursery and I said, how much would it cost me to buy and install these species back in there? And in that 1 acre area, there was about a $30,000 layout of plants that might not be readily identifiable just from looking at this picture or standing at the edge of the woods. But about $30,000 worth of native plants were actually in there. So if we didn't stress selectivity on the RFP, the request for proposals for this project, and we didn't have tight specifications, you would lose about $30,000 of native plants. So it's really important to be selective in the control and make sure the contractor understands that. Just to give a good example, I thought it was great when I found these pictures. You know, if a contractor's in there and they accidentally kill some of your larger trees, they overspray, they accidentally hack and squirt the wrong species of tree, you can actually look and find examples of how much it costs to replace a tree. And then you can put that value into the cost of the control. So it's not just the trees they're killing, but it's the cost. If you get a low bid and it's cost $10,000 and they look at that ailanthus stand and say, I can do this for $10,000, but you get another bid that's $30,000 and you know they're a lot more selective in their control, you're going to actually save the money, even though it costs that much more in the initial treatment. Not having to replace all those natives that are going to be killed by accident with the cheaper contractor is kind of worth the money that's going to be spent in the short term and the long term. Here's just an example of a company that moves trees. And I'm not just talking about small trees, but you can actually see the size of the trees that they're able to move. You can see the techniques, the size of the thing, the machines they have to use. Obviously, this isn't cheap. So if I was going to go out there and say, in my contract, if you accidentally kill, you know, a certain percentage of native species, you know, we're going to penalize you for it. And for every tree this, you know, caliper, it's going to cost, you know, $4,200 for a 20-inch caliper tree. If you kill it, you have to have insurance that covers that much to cover that tree. So you can actually build into your contract a way to assure that your contractor is going to be selective and careful in what they're doing. Otherwise, they might just be haphazard in the way they work. So, you know, sometimes we think, well, you can't really justify that or quantify that with numbers. Well, you really can. You know, even the species that a lot of people aren't familiar with, make sure they know the difference between native rose and non-native multiflora rose. You know, if you have a little bit of identification tools in your pocket, you'll know, you know, what to look at, whether it's the color of the flower, whether it's something on the stem. Make sure they understand those things. When we worked for Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., I remember when Sue Salmons was there, she would actually, during the pre-bid conference, take the contractors out, have a stand in the forest, and she would test the contractors in the forest, and she would pull down a vine and say, what's the name of this vine? Tell me something about it. In that case, it was porcelainberry or grapevine, and she was trying to trick the clients. And, you know, what they found out was half the people there really didn't know what they were looking at. The other half were very familiar with it, and she was able to really narrow down who she wanted to pick just by doing that. Another thing you have to think about in your bid specifications and how you're going to write up this work and get your contractor out there is what's on the property besides those native plants. You know, have you ever looked in there? What type of methodology are you going to use? The methodology is going to really create some concerns sometimes. Here's an example of a state park in Georgia where they had a rare and endangered trillium here for the state of Georgia. But the manager, who is a great guy and he does a lot of really good things, unfortunately went in there with a mulching machine and mulched the entire area without really thinking about the fact that this plant was in there. Now, they called me out like a month later, and this was the picture I took on that day, and there were, you know, all the state biologists were there. They were on the site, and I didn't really know why I was going. When I got there, I looked at it, and I thought, wow, what on earth happened here? Well, they called me out there because they wanted to see at this point, now that this has happened, is there anything we can do to restore the site? Unfortunately, you know, it was a really harsh thing to do. They were opening up a view across the ravine to look at the nature center from the road. So it really wasn't worth the effort. But I'm sure this site is recovered. You can look at the benefits of it, you know, and say, well, it was like a level 5 infestation of invasive species as well. At least it got knocked down to that point. The question is, has this been managed over time? So consider the treatment method in your RFP. Consider what type of tools they're going to use, and also consider making sure that there's a long-term plan. If you can put it into your contract, make sure that contractor is going to be there for the long term to treat it for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, because the resprouts, the seed bank, the ineffective treatments are going to be needing a retreatment. In your package, make sure you're defining the long-term plan for the site. What's the scope of the project? You know, describe it in your document. Make sure you understand your objectives, outline the tasks, identify the species for removal in the document. Don't just say, like we've seen many, many times, I've got 500 acres and a lot of invasive species, treat them all. You know, you're going to get bids from $1,000 to $1 million with something like that. You have to be specific. Know the species, know the methodology, and also show them the desirable species too if you can, so that they'll know what to treat and what not to treat. Define the project in depth. Let them know the level of infestation. If I as a contractor go in, or I'm asked to do a phone bid, if I'm told it's Chinese privet and it's on 5 acres, that really doesn't tell me a lot. If I'm told it's Chinese privet and it's a level 5, or it's a high infestation, I know that there are, you know, hundreds of stems per square yard that I have to deal with in this understory. I need to know if it's in an understory. Are there desirable species overhead? Or is it just out in an old clearing where I could do a foliar spray, which is going to be, you know, $200 an acre versus $6,000 an acre if I had to cut and treat everything. The cost really is affected by the definition of what you're doing. So let them know if it needs to be selective. Let them know what the terrain is like. Is it flat? You know, are we talking about vertical acres or are we talking about flat acres? Is this a site where we can use chemicals or not? Is there water around? Are there certain chemicals we cannot use? The cost goes into every one of those variables. Make sure they know exactly what to expect, and you're going to get a good price estimate that way. If they're guessing, you're going to get a price estimate that really isn't going to help you or them. Here's an example. This site in the Everglades. If I was to be given a phone call and they said, we've got bunch of invasive plants and they're growing in the Everglades, can you please come and treat them? Well, there's not much I can do. On the right side of the road, you see the site that hasn't been treated yet. It's got Australian pine, it has Melaleuca, you know, it's got, you know, quite a few other things. If you look on the left side of the road, you see a site that has been treated, but it has some resprouts, it has some regrowth, it needs to be treated. So in the RFP, I need to define that. Untreated site with Melaleuca with Brazilian pepper, with Australian pine, etc., etc. This many acres. The growth is pretty mature in this site. It's not saplings. This is not something you can foliar spray. You're going to have to hack and squirt or cut and treat. Really throw the definition in there. On the left side of the road, I can say this site was treated a year ago. There are stumps that are there. There are resprouts coming up, but you would be able to use foliar applications in much of this. If there's a species that needs a different type of treatment, outline it. But your cost per acre is going to be about $6,000 per acre on the right side of the road, and maybe $100 to $200 per acre on the left side of the road. So really need to define that. Define what type of equipment you want them to use. If you want to have more environmentally friendly equipment, make sure it's in the bid specifications. And this is why, because if they don't know that ahead of time before they give you a price, and they have to go out and buy some of this equipment, then they're going to underbid and they're going to lose, and they won't provide the service that you want. Make sure they know ahead of time that you need a 4-stroke low-emission brush cutter, because they might need to go spend $600 to get that brush cutter, and they need to put that into their pricing. If you want them to use a certain type of vegetable oil-based bar oil, well, that's fine, but let them know ahead of time, because it probably costs twice as much as the regular oil. And all these other examples are the same thing. Make sure that when you do have the equipment that everything's labeled and the chemical name and rate is on all the backpacks. Make sure they're not accidentally mixing chemicals in backpacks that were used for another project. Make sure they come there with a clean tank. Make sure there's specifications that that they're cleaning that tank every day. You don't always have to give them the specifications on how to run their company, but you can certainly make sure that they have those specifications in place just by asking them. So again, define the methodology required, kind of like I showed you that slide on the Everglades a few seconds ago. I don't know if you've ever seen the herbicide ballistic technology, but that's an actual method that's being tested by Dr. Leary from Hawaii. They put paintballs that are full of chemicals in a paintball gun, and they shoot at these trees. You can see the mark off in the distance there. And it does a basal treatment on the trees. And they're testing them in areas that are just really hard to access. Maybe in Hawaii when they're up in a mountain and they're actually in a helicopter, then they have to shoot down on the canopy of the tree. I don't know that any of us will be using that method, but if that's something you want to use, make sure you're telling them, this is what I want you to do. Whether it's that or using a brush cutter or foliar spraying or no chemicals allowed, no gas and oil allowed, make sure you're using a leverage tool. Make sure they know that. Be thorough in your requests. If you want, this is a good example of a site that you could have either used a helicopter and foliar sprayed the Melaleuca stand here, or you could have gone in on foot like they did here and actually hack and squirt that. And that's the difference, I believe, between the South Florida Water Management District and another land manager on their techniques. So one crew had to go in and hack and squirt the entire Melaleuca stand you see off to the right there, and probably Australian pine. In the previous picture, they just flew over it with a helicopter. So obvious price differences. If you have a crew of 20 or 30 going in with a hatchet and a hand sprayer, and they're going through and knocking out this picture, versus just having a helicopter and probably in minutes knocking out that one patch. Make sure you're defining how you want it done, because they might not know that the regulations don't allow them to fly a helicopter over this particular site. And also make sure the contractor's using their brain. Make sure we're telling them how to use it properly if they don't know. I'm looking at this site at Tallulah Gorge, and I'm looking up at the waterfall, and there's about 30 people standing around me on the boardwalk looking up at the waterfall as well. Now, there's a couple options here. This is Japanese stilt grass. You can either go in there with a backpack sprayer with blue dye, stand in the middle of the water, spray that plant and kill it. The chemical you're using, the blue dye is fine. Everything probably would be labeled for that use. But how smart is that? Not very smart at all. Make sure on a site like this, the specs read that you need to hand pull this stuff. Put it in a bag and walk away with it. You have to think about the other people, the visitors that are on your sites as well when you're considering your treatment methodology. If this was in the back country, it might be something else. But in high visibility like this, let's make sure that you're putting on a good picture for the visitors. Again, make sure they understand they can't foliar spray this site, or maybe they can, but they have to use a wand that's low to the ground. You can't use a high boom on all this thistle in Frederick, Maryland, because that high boom will drift right into your tree plantings there and kill every one of those trees. It sounds logical, but there's a site here where that actually happened, and they killed all the trees. Make sure you're telling the contractor how to do it sometimes. You have to tell them it's your property. It's what you have to protect. If you were building your house, you wouldn't just let the contractor decide, oh, I like this better than that, I'm going to do it. You would tell them exactly what you want. Use the selective methods. Make sure they know to use a wand instead of a spray gun if they need to be spraying English ivy around ferns. Talking about Sue Salmons back at Rock Creek, I also remember her, once we started working there, they actually put together a performance penalty if we killed native plants. Well, the downside on this site was there was porcelain berry, which is this leaf, mixed in with grapevine, which is this leaf, in many, many areas throughout this site. So we had to go through and hand pull and untwist porcelain berry to get it out of the English ivy here, excuse me, the grapevine. We knew the difference. We knew the berries, the difference in the color of the berries. Over here is the grapevine, over here is the porcelain berry. We knew the difference in the look of the vine and everything else. But most contractors aren't going to know that. And if you want to be that specific, make sure the details are there and they understand how to do it. Test them while they're in the field, like I was saying before. See if they know the difference between this plant and that plant. Which chemicals create more selective control? Another thing to make sure of when you're talking about methodologies and is write down in the specifications, don't foliar spray up into the trees. The first thing we recommend when we're doing vines like kudzu or porcelain berry or oriental bittersweet is to give it a haircut. Cut it at about eye level and then get the vines on the ground, cut the big stumps, treat the big stumps, and then come back and foliar spray, because everything you need to foliar spray is now at the ground level. Instead of having to spray up into this tree and risk drift and risk, killing the tree itself, cut it off the tree. All that stuff will decay pretty quickly and fall off, and the tree will be saved, and you'll be treating everything on the ground. But write that in the specifications. Make sure they understand that, or they're just going to take out their big hose and their powerful sprayer, and they're going to spray straight up in that tree and all around the edges, and you're going to have a big brownout that you really don't want. There's a lot of species that look alike. At a distance, you might not notice the difference between Virginia creeper and akebia. Up close, it's a little easier, but when people are spraying and treating, they're not paying attention. At this site in Montpelier, it was really, at a distance, hard to really see the difference. You see 5 leaves, people were spraying it. Make sure they know that that plant is in there if you don't want to treat the Virginia creeper. Be very specific in all your different methodologies. Just an example, if you're doing basil bark application, make sure you're telling them the uniform they have to wear, that they need to treat the entire base circumference of the stump, or the tree. Don't cut it first in most cases. Some species you do, but tell them if you have to. Treat up to, however many inches up you have to, 3 to 4 inches high, depending on the size of the tree. Ask them to use a marker dye to show that they're actually using chemicals and where you can actually see where they put the chemical down. There's other examples of contractors spraying for, in the fall, near the end of the season when things are dying, and they find out later that they didn't even put chemical in the water. They were just spraying water on there. So make sure they're using chemical. Make sure, if that's what you want to use, make sure they have a blue dye in there. That way you know whether that blue dye is going to show up wherever the chemical is. So if it's on a native species, you'll know. If it's on the crew, if it's on people, you'll know they're not being careful enough. Don't overspray. Don't treat while the ground is frozen. Make sure you always have the specifications there for the type of method you're asking them to do. And we can talk about it. If you want to call me or email me, I can give you all kinds of examples for all the different methods, whether it's cutting and treating, using a ATV, or any other type of foliar spray. Make sure they've got the right equipment. They don't need this. That's Michael Luss there, suited up at NCTC up in West Virginia. You don't need to go to that extreme. But you do need to have your PPEs in place. Make sure they have their equipment on. Make sure they have the proper measuring tools. Look at those pictures. Is that safe? No, I don't think so. Make sure they're not juggling chainsaws in the field. Make sure they've got a helmet on with a guard on the helmet. Make sure they are wearing chaps when they're in the field. Make sure that in your specifications it says the proper PPEs will be worn, and here's a list of them that we expect you to wear based on the type of project we're doing. Okay, so moving on. Use an accurate method to develop a project cost. I think this is a good example of how it probably happens often. How many studies show that? 87. Well, I think a lot of people just wing it like that. I don't think they really know where these costs are coming from. Really important to figure that out. We talked a little bit about that before, but I would say make sure they know the level of infestation, or you do. And then there's a lot of charts out there, and I can send them to you, that show, you know, for a level 5 multi-stem species, it should cost about this much per acre to do the treatment in the first year. For a level 1, which is very light, you know, infestation on trees, it should cost this much per acre. And we've got a lot of lists. If you go look at our GSA schedule, you'll see a list of all the different methodologies based on all the different plants that you're treating. And it gives a good generic number, a good place to start, basically, so you'll know if I'm doing this type of treatment, it should be about this much. That way, when you get a bid, you'll know whether you're getting way under bid or way over bid. You can kind of get a good range that way. Be tough on these guys. If they mess up, if we mess up, I tell our clients, if we mess up, tell us. Don't wait. Tell us right away so we can remedy the problem. We actually got to the point we started asking different clients to go ahead and give us a performance requirement, give us performance guarantees. So they have to provide the information prior to the bidding. They give us timelines and completion dates, you know, and there's different ways that we can request extensions if necessary. Adhere to the completion dates as best as possible. Depending on weather, it's not always possible, but it can be done. Sometimes it's the contracting mechanism that messes things up, but the point is to make the effort. Make sure they know the days they can and can't be on the site. If there's a holiday and they can't go in there, make sure they know that. We did a site in Michigan once for Phragmites, and we weren't allowed to take any ATVs or anything back in the site. We had to walk back with backpack sprayers, spray the Phragmites, walk back out a couple miles, walk back in. I think it took about a month to do that. If we hadn't known that ahead of time, that we couldn't use a vehicle to get in even though there were paths, you know, our pricing would have been a lot different. Clearly state how the performance will be measured and evaluated as well. Make sure you're protecting the interest of both parties with this performance guarantee. Give them the timeline, the completion date. What we ask is, or we suggest to a lot of clients is, use a percentage holdback on our pay for up to a year after the treatment. So it usually doesn't take a whole year. Usually if the treatment's in May, you know whether the treatment was effective by, you know, July or even June for that matter. But hold back, you know, maybe even if it's just holding back a month, make sure that you see that the treatment they did holds up to their specifications. Ask for a guarantee. You know, we'll guarantee certain species. On multi-stem species, it's easy for us to guarantee that a certain, you know, the tree stumps that were treated will have a 99% mortality rate. Other species, it's a little harder because of the seed bank, like stiltgrass. But you can certainly look at and evaluate the site and know whether it was treated with water or with a chemical. So use that percentage holdback, and then that makes them realize, okay, I still have $5,000 on the table to get paid. We're going to do it right the first time, so when it's time to get paid, I can actually get that check in the mail. And then there's, you know, you can have detailed project tracking tools. There's a webinar later today and a few more if you look at your list that we sent out. And if you didn't get that list, let me know and I'll send you a copy of it. We're going to talk a lot about some of the online tools we've developed, and we developed them to help us satisfy the clients that we have, and in turn we've realized that the clients can utilize a lot of these tools as well for their own purposes. So we've kind of built some packages for that, and I'm going to discuss those later. But just to give you an idea, I'm going to back out of this really quickly, and I'm just going to jump online. You know, make sure your contractor or you have something in place that allows you to track the work that they're doing. Make sure you can evaluate it in the short term and the long term. Lots of times it's site sheets, and you can have specific site sheets that are developed. What we realized was those just weren't dynamic enough, and they didn't allow us to get the information quick enough to the client, and everything was just slow. So with technology as it is today, we were able to actually utilize and build some software and some apps that we use and that our clients use and that they actually purchase to use for other things as well. And the only one I'm going to show you during this presentation is the site sheets, because I think they're just wonderful the way they work. And in our case, we have this online tool, so our crew and our client can get on their iPhones, their Androids, their tablets, their computer in the office at any point during the day, okay? So our crew, every time they work on a site, they plug in all the data for the site sheet right there while they're working that day. And as soon as they hit submit, then on the other end, our client can get on their computer, a minute later and see exactly where that crew is in the same day, the same hour as they just completed the work. And they can see everything about that site. So just to give an example, I'm going to go to the treatment that has been put in here most recently. So let's just look at December 5th at Fort Detrick, and going there we can see that this is what you would see on your end, this is what we would see on our end, and by putting a tool like this and saying we need you to track the progress like this in the bid specs, it gives you an advantage in a lot of ways. So you can see who worked on the site, the number of hours they worked, you can see the temperature range during the day, the time they were there, you can see the site conditions were kind of medium, you can see the sky, the wind. You can see whether it was flat or steep. You can see the acreage treated was 16 acres on this particular site. You can see the chemical that they used, the solution that they used, and you can see the species they treated all right here. If you wanted to, you can click on all these things and get more detail on it. I'll just click on one just to show you. You can also click on the polygons, and you can view where they've been working. So you can actually see very specifically the site that they were working on or are working on, for that matter. By the middle of today, we're going to have sites in here where the guys are working today. And we're going to be able to actually pull them up and see today's work. And you can see the species they're working on. In this case, white mulberry. They can download pictures to show those sites and what species they're working on as well. This is low 3-acre site. On this area, they're working on Japanese honeysuckle, about 3 o'clock p.m., low density. But all this stuff, when you're hiring the contractor, if they have a tool like this or you have a tool like this that you can use for them, it allows you to really see what they're doing, know they're working in the area they're supposed to work on, the species they're supposed to work on, but it also lets you understand how this site needs to be treated in the long term too, because it allows you to track the way things have been treated, what's been successful and what hasn't been. So there's other tools, and like I said, if you look at our information, I'm going to go through demonstrations on all those tools later today and in the days ahead, but I just wanted to kind of run that by you really quickly. So that's what those are. One thing I wanted to mention really quickly is there's a lot of contracting options out there for you to use. You can just put a general bid out to the public and get as many groups bidding on something as possible. I feel really nervous about that in this industry because you are asking people to work on pretty sensitive natural areas. So I'd say get more specific. In our case, we just got accepted on the GSA schedule a year ago. And the GSA schedule is just a federal contract, basically, that they vet you out. They put us through a rigorous proposal process to look at all our references, to look at all the detail about the work we do, to really kind of look at our financials and everything that's involved with the business, to determine that we were qualified to be on this schedule. Now, when a federal agency in the United States wants to hire us, they can go to this schedule and they can pick off the schedule the other companies like ours. So it doesn't have to be 300 companies bidding on it. They can pick 3 or even 1 off of this schedule and utilize that company for their services. And that way, you save a lot of the headaches of this vetting out we're talking about through this whole presentation is kind of done ahead of time through the GSA schedule. There's different ways of doing it. You can use GSA Advantage. Just if you go to our website and click on our GSA link, you'll see all the information about the GSA schedule there. Just scroll down the particular document that comes up. There's BPAs where you can actually do blank purchase agreements where it's an open contract, but there's no money in it until you want to put it there, and then you can just call that contractor up and say, come and do the work. But you save a lot of the headaches involved in the RFP process. So kind of to conclude, I always say you can either pay for first class contractors or you can pay for coach class, and you get what you pay for. If you want a successful contractor, kind of take take some of the points that I've thrown in here. Like I said, this is being recorded, and you can get online here probably by tomorrow and look at it again or send it off to someone that you think needs to hear this type of information. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now, and then I'm going to start taking some questions.